My name is Anita Verna-Crofts. I'm the Associate Director at the Communication Leadership Graduate Program at the University of Washington. And on behalf of all of us at CommLead, thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you to our final presentation of our student COVID. I'd like to welcome you all to our final presentation of our Student COVID Consultancy Speaker Series. Our topic tonight is working in a distributed team during COVID. This is week 10 of spring quarter at the University of Washington, and it's my 10th year with the CommLead program. And it's always a week when students and faculty alike are really drawing on deep reserves, with graduation like a beacon pushing us forward. But this is a very different week 10 for me and our CommLead and our University of Washington community than all the 9 of them that came before. The global pandemic created the opportunity for CommLead students to lead in a way forward for our community and our campus, and that is exactly what this remarkable COVID consultancy has done. But the illnesses we face are not this pandemic alone. Racial violence and institutional racism cannot be cured with a vaccine. Dismantling systems of oppression takes work, it takes hope, it takes courage. But I, for one, choose not to accept in this moment that it need take time, in the way we often use such a phrase as if begging patience. We as a nation are past due, and may we be swift and unyielding in our collective liberation. A few announcements before I introduce my colleague and dear friend and tonight's special guest, Claudia Chang. First, as you know from when you joined, we are recording tonight's conversation. Second, if you would be so kind as to turn on your camera, if your Wi-Fi allows you to do so, we always love to see who's joined us on the call and to build community in that visual way. Third, please type your questions for Claudia at any time during the session in the chat box, and our wonderful Zoom DJ tonight, Mo Herbert, will then collect and help pose and curate those questions during the Q&A section of our time together today. And you can also message Mo privately with a question if you would prefer, and you do that by indicating in the chat box, instead of sending the message to everyone, you can do a drop down and find Mo Herbert and send her your message privately. That's perfectly acceptable. We encourage that. And finally, before I introduce Claudia more deliberately and thoughtfully, we're going to take just a moment, and I'm going to ask Evelyn, who's a member of the COVID consultancy, to screen a quick video that will give you a little bit more insight into the work of this 5-person student team.
Does the COVID-19 pandemic have you or your organization struggling to connect? The University of Washington's Communication Leadership Program is here to help. We have assembled our COVID-19 consultancy to help nonprofits, small businesses, and on-campus departments. We can help you communicate within your organization and with your audience, pivot communication strategies in the face of COVID-19, create videos and other multimedia assets, and host online events. As community builders and communication professionals with expertise in digital technology, our graduate students and alumni are uniquely equipped for this moment. We're offering pro bono consulting, events, and professional connections. Whether you're a business owner, an employee, or simply looking to improve your communication strategies, we're here to help you. For more information and to schedule a consultation, visit bit.ly/UWCOVIDhelp.
Thanks, Evelyn. And I'm reminded that later on in the program, as you listen for questions being posed, and Mo, are not only the DJ for tonight on the call, but also our multimedia tutor and student in the program, you might recognize her voice. She is also the voiceover for the video and the designer of said video. So she plays many different roles, wears many different hats. So thank you for that. Now, on to the star of the show. We are so lucky tonight to be sharing a screen with Claudia Chang, CommLead affiliate instructor and founder of Emerald Global, a consulting firm providing global executive leadership and change management. Claudia and I were introduced about a decade ago by a mutual friend, and Claudia and I share experience of having studied in China in the early 1990s, which is a bond that even if you weren't known to one another at that time, it's an immediate point of connection for anyone that studied in China in the 90s. And 3 years ago, Claudia and I started talking about the possible courses that she could offer at ComLead given her rich expertise. And at that time, she pitched a course that looked at leadership behavior and distributed teams. And that's a course that she built and has been part of our curriculum since 2018. Fast forward to today, and Claudia and ComLead look really prescient. So many of us, as a result of the pandemic, are now working in distributed teams, and that work migrated to the virtual really almost overnight. Certainly felt that way. And even before this COVID consultancy was formed, ComLead was clear that we needed to create a forum to have members of our community, such as Claudia, share their expertise. Because unlike many of us, Claudia's been working in distributed teams a lot longer than many of us. And so to be able to have that vision and framework for engaging with this kind of work is really exciting. So Claudia, I'd love to begin. I'm gonna cede the screen to you, and I know you've got a presentation to start us off. I'll follow up with a few questions, and then we'll move to questions from the floor, or from the screens. And as I said earlier, please, anyone that would like to drop a question into the chat box, either directly to Mo or as part of the general chat box, please do so. After we've had a nice chance for all of you to pose questions to Claudia, we're going to close with a short activity, which I'm very much looking forward to, that is of Claudia's design, and then she'll have a call to action, as all 4 previous speakers have had, as a way to close our time together. After that, I'll just have a couple announcements, and then, as always, we will stop the recording and have a virtual gather around the podium, greet Claudia, have a chance for more casual conversation to close the evening. So with that, it is my pleasure and privilege to extend a warm welcome to Claudia. The screen is yours, and we so look forward and are so grateful that you're here to spend the evening with us on this topic.
Well, thank you, Anita, and thanks, everyone. I just want to say hello to everyone, wherever you are, and thanks for adding this to your day or your evening or your morning. We're going to find out in a moment where exactly you are, but so just know that that question is coming your way. It is delightful to be here, and I've already asked Anita and her colleagues to help me with some of the time management if needed, because I get really, really excited talking about these kinds of things, so I might just sort of run away. So she's going to help sort of keep that on track. So just, thank you for the opportunity to be here with you, and just thanks for letting me be part of your day, whichever day it is. So what are we doing here? This conversation is really going to be looking at how is it that we can start building stronger connections and teams and our own leadership in the distributed space, right? So that's really what we're going to be looking at, is how can we build that effectiveness, right? And we're going to do that in a couple of different ways. You're going to have a chance to meet each other in a moment. I'm going to share with you some of the key approaches or principles that I have seen in my practice around the world, as well as working with teams in Seattle, as well as being part of the ComLead community. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have a chance to hear from you in a little bit of a different way, which we'll get to shortly, where you're going to be talking about some of the things that you've learned or some of the things that you might try as a result of this conversation, right? So the first thing I'd invite you to do as we get into this conversation is to track 2 questions for your own learning. And because I just like to try to do things a little different and I'm old school, I'm going to show you the questions. We have no PowerPoint slides or anything. So the first question I would like you to keep in mind as we go into our conversation is this. What is something I learned from today? Okay. Just what's something I learned? Maybe you're going to learn that you're just more amazing than you thought at this, right? Or maybe you're saying like, oh, there's something that I can really grow, or here's where I get onto a little bit of an edge. The second thing I want you to track, in addition to what's something that you've learned, is what is something I will try from today, right? Am I hearing something that resonates or that is a useful thing where I'm already I'm going to try to do more of that, or it's maybe a completely new thing I'm going to try. I've never thought about leaving my Zoom link open without having a meeting, but just being connected to Anita somewhere else in case something happens, as if we were sharing a virtual office. Right? So what is something I've learned from today, and what's something that I will try? Not what is something I hope to try, what is something that I am thinking to try, but I will try, to make that commitment to yourself to grow and to build your strength in the leadership space. Okay, so those two questions. So now, if I had a dollar or a yuan or a euro for every time someone asked me, how come you don't use the word remote teams? How come you don't say something like telework? Why do you use the word distributed teams? How come not remote? We're working remote. I work from remote. We have a remote workforce. And the reason is because, for me, distributed teams, from what I see in my work, is a more inclusive way of thinking about the different ways that people work together. Okay? So the first point is a sense of positionality. Remote suggests a relation into something else. You can't be remote just as a fact. It is in relation to, you live in a remote town, you're from a remote village. It suggests somehow being out of the center, you're being out of some core place. In the business world, this is often framed as, well, I don't work at headquarters, right? Or I'm not in the main campus, right? And a couple of things. One of the things is that, what I see now in terms of working and trends, that more and more teams are distributed. They're in different places, and there's less and less of that automatic concentration of everyone's at the head office, whatever that means. The idea of what's the head office is changing. So things are flattening, right? You might have a CEO based in Seattle. You might have the chief financial officer based in the Beijing office. You might have a whole team that's a startup that they're all in Seattle. They all may be in Capitol Hill. Okay, but for business purposes or environmental purposes, they're deciding not to invest resources in an office space. So a team that lives within 2 blocks of each other would not necessarily be considered a remote team, right? But they are distributed, right? And so this is the reason that the language right from the beginning is framed as a distributed team as compared to remote. And teleworking is simply a vocabulary that refers to an earlier way of working in a distributed sense, right? So, for those of us who are old enough to have had a landline or to remember what was kind of the initial working from home or working outside of the head office was like, you had to literally unplug your phone, plug the telephone into the modem, and then put the modem into your computer, right? So that term teleworking is also not necessarily so resonant with where we are in time, because I would guess, I don't know, but I have a feeling that not many people on this call have like a telephone as it was used for the term teleworking. You don't have a landline, right, to plug it in, okay? And some of you may be just like, what is she even talking about? Okay, so look it up. Look up the word teleworking, and then you'll sort of have that history lesson there for everyone. So this is the reason that as we get into some of the specific approaches, that is why distributed teams, the work that I specialize in, is around distributed team and distributed leadership. Simply what happens when we're not together in any other in any range of contexts. Okay? So one of the points of view I'm making here is that while distributed teams may mean distance, right? It may mean separation, all right? It is not something that needs to break apart connection, right? A distributed team may mean distance, but it can actually be an accelerant for fostering connection. It can be an accelerant for bringing more inclusivity and diversity to a team. Why? Anything from reasons of geography, right? You're able to bring someone in and work with somebody who might be in Sri Lanka, who might be in South Seattle or in North Seattle, right? And you don't need to go through mechanics of getting visas and all those kinds of things. It can also be an accelerant because it democratizes the way people are engaging, okay? We're all in a similar space, a digital space, right? Many of us can relate to if there's a face-to-face meeting and somebody needs to dial in. It's very easy to forget about that person who has dialed. See, there I go with my history lesson again, who is clicked in through Zoom, right? I'll give you an example of how it can build sort of community and inclusivity. Anita had mentioned that I am part of the Calm Lead faculty team, okay? I do not live in Seattle. All right, so every quarter there are faculty meetings, and probably 98% of them I have not participated in them, right? Either for travels or work or for whatever reasons. Now, because of COVID, we've had weekly distributed team faculty meetings, and that has been a completely different dynamic in terms of meeting people. I'm able to connect with people. I'm able to contribute to the larger cohort, right? So that's just a micro example of how distributed teams have that point of view, I would say, to help foster that kind of community, right? And so that's just one of the things I want to start with, because I think often, particularly in times like COVID, right, when we have a switch or a swerve into working in a distributed space, it's often met more with trepidation, like, oh no, like, what's that going to mean, right? I can't go to that place anymore. And maybe there are some people who, when you switch into a distributed team context, will say, yay, that's terrific, right? But the sort of initial reaction is usually one of, what's that going to look like, and how to sort of, there's a little bit of a kind of mental bracing for it almost somehow. So if you're someone who's saying, hey, how can I build some stronger teams through attention to communication and leadership, either as my own leadership profile or just the leadership in the team, regardless of if you're the leader. I'm not talking to people who are just only like the boss or in charge. Leadership is for everyone. So that's the other point that I want to make about this, okay? So there are 3 areas that I'd like to highlight as these are different areas that can help us to become more effective in the distributed team space, right? And if there's one word I would use, is to double down on your deliberateness in each of these areas, right? So try to be more intentional in these 3 areas. So going back to continue with my format, the first area is how we manage details. Okay, and when I say details, really what I'm talking about is how we think about and how do we prioritize the kind of information that we need to have for our teams, that we want to communicate across our teams, as well as how we share that information, right? In this conversation, we're not going to talk about how to run a good Zoom meeting, or there's so much great information out there that has come up, especially in the last few months, about, how to do these kinds of things from a technology perspective. I'm talking about the way we think from a leadership perspective about how we want to communicate. So what are some of the points that I want to make about how we manage information and details? Is to prioritize getting a sense of what does your team need around information. How much do they need? What kind do they need? And how do they want to have that information, right? We have all been in meetings sometimes where we're saying, okay, great. So Anita just said the report's due on Friday. She's going to send out the guidelines. I'm good, all right? And someone else may be like, that's it? I need way more information about that. And so how can we as communicators be able to then best tap into asking those kinds of questions around the information? Is this enough? Do you need more? What else do we need? right? Because we've also all been in situations, and this speaks to the diversity of teams, where we're sitting there and we're saying, I can't believe we're still talking about this. Like, I know what I need to know, so let's go. Is this meeting over, or why are we still talking about this, right? So that's the first point around the details, is prioritizing getting clear on the information needs across your diverse team. Okay. The second piece that I want to make around the information and the details is really putting a premium on results and being super clear on what are the results that you're working towards, right? Some of you may know the term, a results-oriented workplace, which is where you're just looking at what is the goal that we're working towards to deliver this production, or we want to do this report. And then the way people do that is less of an issue, right? And the reason I focus on results in the distributed team is because, as we've seen there, you just don't have as much visibility on what everyone's doing, right? And there's a diversity around work styles. Some people will say, like, look, if I have 2 weeks to do that report, I'm going to wait till like the day before, because that pressure helps me do my best work, right? So as long as they're clear on the outcome, then there's less attention to, well, how are you going to actually get that done? Where someone else will say, well, I know that we're clear on that result, but I'm going to need to allocate, 2 hours a day. Like, the diversity of our work styles becomes less of something that we need to have day-to-day visibility on when we're in a distributed space, because we can't have as much visibility on it. So prioritizing the results that we're looking for is one of the details aspects that I think helps bring an overall team to a higher level of productivity as well as effectiveness, right? Now, why is that so important, right? Because we know in a distributed team versus face-to-face, things can sometimes feel more structured, they can feel more scheduled, right? But we also don't have that connectivity of the face-to-face interactions that can help us, right? I mean, if you think about when you're in an office, you have countless micro exchanges with people, either verbally or spontaneously, that can help move along a sense of how things are going, right? And so you have moments to talk about things, you have moments to check in. In a distributed space, as we know, you don't necessarily have that ease or access. And so being clear on the results can also take some of the pressure off of needing to know where things are, because if you're clear on what you're trying to work towards, those meetings and the deliberate interactions just have a little bit less of that pressure on it. Okay, so that's the first piece of focusing on some of the details around information and results can help us advance some of our effectiveness in that distributed space, right? And these are all really good practices, broadly speaking, right? So I want to frame it that this is not something that is so absolutely unique, like only do this when you're in a distributed space, but do something completely different when you're face-to-face. No, it's just a matter of that degree that I would say, really double down on this, I have found, in a distributed space. Second thing is around dialogue, right? What kind of conversations are we having that support people when they're in a distributed space, particularly in acute or crisis situations like now in COVID, where you have an additional intensity and context going on outside that might even further stress some of that structure that can feel more present in a distributed team. So what do I mean by dialogue? What I mean here is, one of the most critical things that we as humans have is the need to feel seen, right? There's a need to be witnessed, that we matter, that someone sees us. And often as communicators, the way we do this is by acknowledging or recognizing what other people are doing. Okay, so let me give you a specific example of the kind of approach I would offer you to sort of double down on the dialogue when you're working in a distributed team. And I call it the, I see you approach, not I see you like the intensive care unit, but I see, I'm looking at you, okay? So what I'm talking about here is bringing the recognition of acknowledging your colleagues and your teams closer to who they are as a person. All right, so let me give you a very specific example. Say Anita and I were working together. And I would say something like, Anita, thanks for sending me that memo. That's great. All right, that is a wonderful kind of acknowledgement, right? But in times of particular crisis, like during COVID or in a distributed space, that need to be seen becomes even more prominent because you might literally not be seen as much, right? It might be you, your screen, your kitchen, and your balcony. Okay, so that earlier comment of adjusting our communications can look like something like this. Thanks, Anita, for bringing the memo, becomes, thanks, Anita, for getting me that memo so early. That was really thoughtful of you to get that earlier to me because the week has gotten so hectic. Right? Or, Mo, that was really, thanks for making time for me on your schedule on Monday. That was really considerate of you to add me so last minute to our time, right? So you make something that somebody does mean something about who they are. That was a considerate thing of you to do. That was a thoughtful thing of you to do, right? And again, this is not unique to the distributed team, but it is a particular approach that I think helps to amplify and meet that sense of connection and need to be seen, right? Now, a point that I want to make about that, in the times when we're giving feedback or struggling with someone, that is not an approach that I would say like, oh, I'm disappointed that you didn't send the memo, Anita. That was really inconsiderate of you to not do that, all right? So I want to make that point that the approach I'm suggesting is one in helping to build connection, which is one of the most critical things we need to double down on as distributed teams. The last point I want to make, right, is around decompression, right? And the decompression is around how can we diversify some of the intensity that happens around distributed team communication, right? We may feel like we're on Zoom all day long, up and down, front to back, right? How can we decompress some of what it is that we talk about, right? We usually tend to have just more business calls when we're in a distributed space. Well, Anita, can we Slack? I need to sort something out, right? And now, we're seeing some really cool practices. People are having like virtual happy hours and they're kind of getting together for other reasons that aren't business related, right? So I would underscore that sort of how can we decompress around our communication style? How can we diversify it, right? To have it not be as transactional, because again, that gets amplified in the distributed team space, right? I have a meeting with my boss at 9 o'clock and it doesn't have all the informality and the spontaneity that you can sometimes have when you're in a face-to-face, like, all right, I'm just gonna go take a walk before this meeting, which leads me to my last point about decompression, is that it's not only what we're doing when we're online, but what is it that we can support ourselves and our teams how to decompress when they're out of this Zoom box right now, right? So I'll give you an example from my own life. Someone just gave me the brain bending suggestion last week to turn off all the notifications on my phone, right? So now I don't know if I have anything in my phone unless I go and look at that, right? I have no Skype, WhatsApp, Slack, nothing. So there is something deliberateness about that allows a sense of decompression, because if I look at my phone, it's just looking back at me. It's not telling me anything. It's not telling me I have a note, a notification about that. Now, some of you may be doing that already, but I wanted to underscore the point of decompression is not just working in the distributed space when it's active and live, but also when we're offline. In the teaching world, we call that asynchronous time, right? When you're not in class, right? So just to recap, these three pieces of, building our deliberateness around information, around results, putting tighter connections between what somebody does and who they are in terms of helping people feel seen. And then from the decompression is just remembering that we may be in a digital space, right? But a distributed team is way more than just digital space, right? It's not, we are not held hostage by tech. I know it can feel like it, and it's like, it can feel like we're swimming upstream, right? And we love tech, right? I mean, it's great. There's so many things that work for us about that, but it is a reminder around doubling down on the like, okay, what are the things that I can do to just amplify that sense of being seen, being clear on understanding how to prioritize information, and then managing some of that intensity by giving attention to decompression around how we support and build our teams. So I am going to hold it right there and just check in with Anita and anyone else and see where we go. So that's what I'm going to offer you for right now.
Claudia, well, this is a marvelous off to the races. And I was so happy to hear that you're experimenting with the reducing or deleting notifications from one's phone. I've put it in the chat, but that's one of the strategies that I encountered in the book Bored and Brilliant by Manoush Zomorodi, who for many years hosted a podcast on our relationship with tech out of WNYC. And she had folks step through some strategies for how to make the phone respond to your needs as opposed to the opposite. And anyway, I did the same thing that you did. I reduced, and eliminated notifications, and it definitely made a difference. And this was pre-COVID, but still decompression in a big way. So I concur on the influence that can have on one's physical and mental well-being.
And if you really just want to take it up another notch, if you haven't already, just put your whole phone on grayscale. Because I'm telling you, Instagram is like totally boring and not interesting if it's all on grayscale, right? It's like a black and white TV. There's some of the things that are better that way, but there's something about it that you're like, oh, okay, I don't need to. It's a phone. I'm supposed to just use it to call people.
Well, and thanks. Evelyn's dropped the link for the book into the chat. Thank you for that, Evelyn. And Mo is reminding us that questions are welcome. I'm going to take this opportunity greedily to be able to engage Claudia in a little bit more of building off of the things that you've shared, which is something that I so enjoy about my friendship with Claudia, is getting a chance to have these conversations. So I'll take over in terms of propelling this forward, but we certainly want to invite others to join the conversation as well. Couple things that I'd love to build off of, and I really appreciate, Claudia, your reminder to all of us that these are best practices universally. And while the talk tonight is situated very much in that idea of a distributed team, and I've actually never heard you make that case for the word distributed. So thank you for setting that framework. As a graduate program in communication, language and word choice is really important. And so thank you for even ushering the conversation forward with thinking mindfully around what's the term that we're using, and why use distributed versus remote or versus fill in the blank. And I will tell you, I have a landline. I decided not to go grab it and bring it into the screen, but I don't know, something about earthquakes. I'm like, I think I need a landline. The Pacific Northwest has rubbed off on me. So one of my first question that came to mind, I was taking some notes as you spoke. One I want to ask has to do with the moment we're in a COVID environment where, speaking personally, we are now coming up beyond a little bit more than 3 months since we've been working in a distributed space. And I'd love to hear you talk a bit around the, how can a distributed team, whether it's one that's been recently formed, like many of us that are engaged in distributed teams because of COVID, or in experiences you've had for distributed teams that have always been distributed, but what are some good strategies for engaging the full team in an assessment of how's it going? Because I know right now, because of the speed with which many of us had to form distributed teams and start functioning at a high level, I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'm sure you've been sought out as a resource to give some ideas for best practices, strategies for taking the pulse and then course correcting or producing better communication systems because the distributed team was created in a somewhat expeditious way. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Love
I
to hear
mean,
your thoughts on that.
well, one of the things that, you know, when it first come to my mind when I was listening to you, Anita, is when we say like, well, you know, what are some ways to check in or get some visibility on how's it going, right? And I would first say to be like, well, what is it? Like, what do we actually mean by how's it going, right? Because that's such a big question that we use so broadly, like, well, how are you? How is everyone today? And it's like, there can be 9 million things going on there, right? So maybe just an answer to your question, when you say like, how's it going? Like, what is it? Would you say?
No, thank you. And this sort of also reminds me of hanging out with a bunch of communication scholars. One of them's like, not clear, Anita. It is not clear. So thank you for reminding me of that, to use my own words. Let's say this. In the case that I'm thinking of experientially, let's call it, in this case, ways in which we are now going to function in a distributed space around communication. And I'll use this example. Because the distributed team experience now has been one of intense focus on delivering. I think also because in the case of, it wasn't a distributed team before, it is now, there's this heightened sense of wanting to do well, even under circumstances that perhaps are not ideal, but the deadlines haven't changed and you're trying to deliver at a high caliber, but all making sense of the world and all carrying different burdens in different ways and existing in different spaces. And so with that emphasis on still wanting to hit the mark professionally, the sociability of being on a team, and you described it to some extent as the informality that can exist in a team environment that maybe is place-based. What are some strategies for bringing that informality and that congeniality back? And you gave that good example of, instead of just sending the one line thank you, I love that idea of attaching qualities and attributes to a person as opposed to just thanking them for a task, because that makes it feel so much more vivid and also meaningful to get that. But I'd also love you to comment on even more broadly, when things become really tunnel vision because you want to do a good job, quote unquote, and those jobs tend to be around metrics of, did I meet this deadline? It's coming perhaps at the expense of, am I laughing with my colleagues? Am I seeing them, even though I'm seeing them so much on screens, but am I seeing them? And so, of course, not course correcting or touching base around how are we doing in terms of not just meeting our deadlines, but building a community and maintaining our community.
You know, one of the things that I have found in a situation with a context like what you're describing, where you suddenly have this big swerve in the road, right? You've just had this unexpected turn that you didn't see coming. And all of a sudden it's like, you know, well, are the wheels coming off? Or like, the wheels can't come off. So what are we going to do to like make sure we're staying on? And I think, you know, going back to sort of, I think some of the way I'm thinking about this conversation around like that deliberateness or double downing, I think raising that question in itself is a really good place to start, is however much you can put above the water to say, all right, so here we are, like this is happening, okay? So what is our reaction to this change, right? So you kind of name it, or you sort of call it out and say like, okay, so what's our reaction to what's happening, right? What are the things that, and depending on the level of connection or trust in the team, you can start getting a sense of mapping out, like, where are people? For some people, they may say like, well, I'm happy to be working at home, right? Because I'm going to get more stuff done, right? And others may say, well, this is how I'm reacting to this change, right? So having an explicit conversation about the experience itself before getting into the, well, this is how are we going to work towards that deadline, right? So that's the kind of focused ways of working, and then preempting that with, again, a little bit more deliberateness around the emotional ways of working, right? Now, that doesn't mean that suddenly everyone's like, let me tell you my deepest fears about working at home, right? But to just have a check-in about like, all right, so what we're gonna do is this is happening now. So what is our reaction to that, right? What kind of experience do we have? Who in the room, what are the resources in the team, right? Who's had experience with other kinds of distributed teams, getting the sense of, well, what are some good experiences you've had? What did you like about it? What didn't you like about it? You're doing a little bit of an assessment in the dynamics of the team, because then I think that also, if you're in a leadership perspective, gives you a sense of what do you have in the room, right? If the team, for example, is not appearing so, affected by this kind of change, that's good information. These are like, so as many data points as you can collect around where people are, I think that's going to be helpful to help manage those conversations about the tasks at hand, right? And related to the tasks at hand, of course, is trying to figure out, well, what does go? What is there any adjustment? What does have flexibility and what might not, right? I think one of the things we see in the trends of distributed teams, this kind of sudden swerve in the time of COVID, is the more explicit teams could be about sort of where they're experiencing this turn, the more likely they were to be able to adapt, right? Because if you think about this in the context of change management, right? Change management is about helping teams get to the edge of the edge, but not too far that they sort of fall over, right? And part of that managing is showing that those kind of explicit, how are we working as a team? What is it that we need to know about each other that relates to whatever we want to share? Some people they're just not going to talk a lot about where they're at, and then you'll see where they're at. All right, but front loading before getting into the task discussion, I have seen and feel like that can put a premium on being able to meet the very real pressure deadlines. Is that answering your question, or is that?
And building off of that, I know that, checking in with a team, whether you're in a leadership position or whether it's a situation where everyone on the team has an opportunity to put forward the necessity of having a group conversation, I'd love to hear, what would you say about our distributed teams? Do they benefit from a more regular level of check-in? And now in the time of COVID, do you have opinions about what leadership in particular could be thinking about in terms of the frequency or perhaps variability of making sure that those check-ins happen?
I mean, my personal experience has been that having some standing regularity around team meetings it helps to anchor the fluidity of more acute situations, say like in COVID, right? The speed with which you switch into that, it can just feel really windy and there's a lot of fluidity. So the extent to which you can try to normalize some of that fluidity, both in terms of offering a kind of standing time, right? And then checking in also with, as you do in good practice anyway, like, well, some people are going to need to have more conversation. They're going to want to talk 10 minutes, but every day. Whereas other people are like, you know what, I'm good. If you don't hear from me, that means because you've done your good homework around doing all the results clarity, they're just like, you know what, you'll hear from me on Friday. Okay. And so, but personally, I have found with teams that I have been in, that I work with, and that I coach, and that when I've been coached as part of a distributed team, that offering that standing time is a good practice. And one of the things that I think is really critical, which is easy to miss, sometimes it'll be like, well, if we have a standing meeting, that means like we have to do something every single time. Or what if we have nothing to say? Or like, what if we don't need it? I have found that there's value in just having that kind of open door policy, that even if nobody has anything to say, the fact that they know that 7 o'clock on Wednesday is the time for you know, I mean, it's a office meeting or office hours kind of dynamic, that is the time where you can rally together if needed, or someone else can just drop in. You don't have to schedule it, because that intensity around a distributed team also ramps up our sense of feeling overscheduled, right? So it's ironic that I have found, I know it might sound a little ironic by saying, well, you're going to have a standing meeting on Wednesday. It may help to alleviate some of that sense of scheduling, because you know you're going to have that time on Wednesday. You don't have to think about trying to find another time, right? And I am certainly not somebody who would say, well, just create a meeting for the point of a meeting. But there's something about having that space. What it does, it also, in my experience, conveys a sense of availability and concern and care for your colleagues and teams, that you dedicate that time, right? So again, going back to that point about a sense of connection and visibility, that you're like, I see this team and our conversation space is valuable, so that will be available. And if you get in there, somebody's like, I got nothing today. And you're like, I got nothing, right? And that's okay. But it is the point that you've had that time allocated, right? Does that answer? Does that help?
And I have, yeah, thank you very much. I've got a couple more questions, but I'm just going to ask one for right now, and then be able to move to the questions that are coming from the floor. And an invitation I'll extend again. Please do put your questions in the chat. I want to ask a question, Claudia, that bridges between Dr. Valerie Manusov's talk last week, which I know not everyone attended, so I'll put a little bit of context around it, but her talk was on nonverbal communication in the time of COVID. And here we are now talking about a reality in terms of distributed teams is we're not able to actually occupy the air together in around a table, and our tables are virtual. And so one of the questions that came up in that conversation was around distributed teams can potentially create environments where certain inequities are magnified, and certain things also then become mitigated. So there are things that become perhaps easier. Everyone's got the same size square. It's not like, where are you sitting at the table? Everyone's the same size square on the screen. So there are things that are more equitable. There are things that can be a little bit harder if you're trying to make space for yourself, and you've been working on making space for yourself in an office environment that's place-based, and now you've moved to a distributed team. What are some recommendations that both leaders can do in terms of trying to mitigate potential inequity moving into a distributed, often virtual space? And what are and so that's really the thrust of the question. But knowing that there may be people on this call that are like, well, I'm not in that authoritative position. What can I do to then influence leadership to also potentially address what can be exacerbated environments in a distributed team, especially now in the time of COVID, where these distributed teams have had to form fast?
Yeah. I mean, you know, one of the things that's so interesting, I think, about that, it's a tension point, right, between the face-to-face and distributed. And it's really easy, particularly now, to sort of look at them as kind of like an Olympic ranking, like which one's better than the other, and for which one, like which one's going to get the gold medal, which one's going to get the silver medal. And, you know, one of the things that I want to emphasize before I get into your question is that by all business trends and by everything I've seen, there are going to be more and more distributed team configurations, right? Yeah. So while COVID may have just kind of brought everyone around me into a distributed team, and then that sort of tide will recede a little bit, you know, surveys are showing, you know, 60% of people in a recent survey in Forbes magazine who are, you know, working in a distributed context said even when the option comes back, they would actually like to explore that more thoroughly going forward. Working in a distributed team does not mean working from home, right? You could go to a co-working space, you can go to a coffee shop. The point is that there's something about this distributed configuration that is serving folks, right? I think it was Twitter that last month announced that even when people have the option to come back to the office, that now there will be 100% option policy to work in a distributed context, right? So I think that brings up the great question that you're asking around, well, with a commitment to equity and inclusion, how do you try to build that environment of inclusion and equity, right? And, the first thing I would say is that, I don't know, you'll know who it was, but I don't know who it is, who said, know thyself, right? Like that work about sort of understanding your own biases or your own assumptions, right, is really, really critical. And if we're like, well, that actually sounds a little bit existentialist, right? I could sort of frame it into one of the courses that I teach with us at ComLead is around, well, what do I do when I get stressed, right? Because that is usually a good indicator of how we respond to things that can then scratch at equity, right? Like, do I get more forceful? Do I withdraw? What is it that I do? We can ask ourselves, what do I do when dynamics get a little bit intense in a team? All right. So what does this have to do with then building equity and inclusion? Is that by, again, bringing out that conversation into a place sort of above the waterline, right? I think that's something that can help, right, to build that sense of people being seen or heard, right? And there are lots of different, I think, tech tools that talk about, well, how to use, Zoom, or how to use Mural or something like or something else to like try to kind of calibrate out. But, if there was something that I would suggest or recommend around building that equity is, what is it that you can understand about how you're working around equity? What are some of your own biases? What are some of your own just kind of stress behavioral points? And then that in itself, I think, will help create a conversation point in a team where you can say, look, how is this going? What is happening? And I really, really want to just value and underscore the value of those one-on-ones, right? And again, it can feel like a challenge, right? If we are zoomed out, we just can't even bear one more Zoom call, right? But the extent to which you can connect with someone, either than like on that landline phone, right? To build in some of that interpersonal connectivity, because those are the things that are going to foster more trust around addressing some of those issues around equity. Like, what does that even mean, right? Like, what is the conversation you can have with a group around when they think of the term equity? Like, what does that look like to them? What have been their experiences of seeing equity? What does inequity look like, right? Because often those conversations will stay at the value statement. Well, equity looks like injustice, or it looks like something that's unfair, right? Well, what is the behavior? Like, if you followed someone around, what would fair dynamics in a team look like? Oh, okay, well, what that looks like to me is, everybody gets a chance to speak, or first come, first serve. You sort of know, you mine out what are some of those behaviors under the values, which then helps to elicit some of that common picture of what equity even looks like. Because as we're seeing, and if there's ever a time in the world where there was more dialogue needed about building equity and being explicit, I would say it's now. I'm going to stop right there to just check in if that's responding
Absolutely.
to your question.
Yeah, and this is a perfect point I'm going to bring Mo in. She's got a couple questions from the floor that we'd love to pose. And so we'll move into that part of the talk, and I appreciate you engaging with me on these. And I think the first question that she'll read you builds off of where you're going with this in a good way. So, hello, Mo.
Hello. So thank you everybody for submitting your questions. Our first question is, what do you feel are the similarities and differences between distributed teams and teams with people with disabilities?
So what are the similarities and the
differences?
Oh, okay. Yeah, the similarities, the first word that comes to my mind would be that sort of word that I was using is like sort of doubling down on the deliberateness, right? Because, you just don't have line of sight. You just don't have the full picture to where someone is at, right? So the extent to which you can be really deliberate about building out that different lexicon of experience, right? Because so, for example, like when you're saying like disability, and I'm going to come to that to a point, right? Like some disabilities are more visible and others are not visible to the eye, right? And in a distributed team, there's a lot going on that we literally don't see, right? Like right now, all you see from me is, you know, what I'm wearing and this plant, and all I see from you, like we're all reduced to like just this kind of micro spot, right? What else is going on and what we're bringing into the room is not there, right? And then in context of different disabilities, right, that is a very different world lived experience, right? So some of the similarities, I think, link around how can we try to bring out actual language or conversation about what those different perspectives are, right? Now, I think with regards to the differences between distributed teams and, you know, teams with disabilities is that, you know, in terms of, that's a very new space, right? That I don't know that the tech world has really kept up with being able to incorporate and support both people who have disabilities in terms of working in a distributed team, as well as those who are working with their colleagues to be able to tap into that explicitness. So I think that's a difference in terms of the differences between distributed teams and teams with people with disabilities.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is, how do you navigate informal back and forth dialogue in the digital space, comparing to stopping by a colleague's cubicle to quickly clarify what was said in an email? And then in addition to that question is that because written communication often seems to be more formal than oral communication, but quick phone calls are hard to schedule.
Yes. I mean, this is, you know, whoever can figure out like the perfect answer to that question, I think has, you know, a very, very bright future ahead of them. What I would suggest is, you know, one of the things in the face-to-face that is, it's so easy to forget that it's even happens, is the spontaneity of contact. It's the spontaneity of communication, right? That you just see somebody in the hallway, you run into someone coming in to the building, and there is a delightness sometimes, right? I mean, a lot of times we're like, I would have preferred not to run into you in the hallway, right? But just sort of talking about the spontaneity is something that we just don't even have to think about in the face-to-face. So that question, like, well, how can you be spontaneous in the digital context? How can you be spontaneous in a distributed team, right? Because everything needs to be scheduled. You're not just going to magically somehow be on the phone with, you know, you're not going to magically be on the phone with someone or on a Zoom call, right? And so one of the things that I can find, this is like a super granular practice, right? But it goes back to my point about remembering that we're not hostages of tech, is how can we use tech in a way that's not scheduled, right? So whether it's something like you say, well, from 10 to 12, we're all going to have our Zoom, we're all going to be in our Zoom room and we're going to be working at home. And if somebody has something, you just sort of say it, right? But you're not actually in an active conversation, right? So someone I'm working with on a project right now, we have that agreement. It's a practice that I'll be doing my thing. You know, I might even be making a cup of coffee or something like that. But we have our connection open that allows for like, it allows for one of those, oh, hey, can I just ask you a question? Let me play this sentence off of you, right? Because it can feel, as the person who asked the question said, a little bit not only structured, but kind of somehow at odds to say, can I call you to discuss this one sentence, right? Whereas when we're in a spontaneous share office with someone, we can just say, hey, how does this sound? Or what do you think about that? And then that's it. So that is a kind of example of how I would offer thinking about using tech for the way we want to, right? It's just as a little bit of a reminder of, you know, you're not the boss of me.
Great. And so moving on to our final question, and after that, we're going to be doing a quick activity in Mural. But our final question is, what might you recommend to effectively advocate for increased inclusion of distributed teams within organizations that have historically relied heavily on headquarters with in-person meetings and interactions?
Right. I mean, this is such a great moment right now because it's kind of like, well, more and more people are working in distributed teams. Like, is there any going back, right? You know, we're seeing those trends that some people are saying, you know, even if we could go back to the office, I'm good not going back to the office. I'm getting more work done. And so there are a couple of different things that I'm thinking about in terms of how to make the case that distributed teams should become a stronger part of our ways of working. Right. And so depending on what industry you work in, depending on what your bend is, you know, if you can show data, right? Going back to your point, Anita, in one of your earlier questions, that like for most people who've made the swerve into distributed teams, those deadlines and deliverables have not changed, right? So the extent to which you can go back and say, look, working in a distributed space, we've delivered on our remits and maybe we've even done more than we thought. So depending, if you're somebody who's saying, hey, let's advocate for more of this, right? You're gonna mine out, well, how can we show that there was more productivity? Or if it's an organization that values wellness, you can look at mining and mapping folks out around how they're doing around wellness indicators related to working in a distributed space. And again, I really want to make the point there that distributed space is not interchangeable with working from home, because as we know, working from home has all kinds of aspects related to privilege and class and what our context is at home around domestic violence or abuse, things like that. So just to check that assumption that if we're talking about distributed ways of working, you know, what is the interplay between working from home? Because those two are very, very different ways of working, right? So to what the extent that you can make cases for deliverables, data, wellness, environmental costs, financial costs, right? There's a lot of different inclusion, right? Look, we've had more people from more of our teams participate as a result of being in this space, right? Or if you're a global organization, you don't have to deal with the same issues around travel and visas and all this kind of thing. So depending on if you want to value or not value, what I would say is you can assemble that case based on data, diversity, wellness, environmental, financial, you know, or business strategy. You might say, we don't want to invest as much. We don't need as big an office as we did before. So those are some things that I would offer to reflect on what's going to build the most effective case if you're saying, hey, let's do more of this going forward, and here's why. Right?
Thank you so much, Claudia, and thanks for all those questions. At this point, I'd love to turn it back to you, Claudia. I know you've got a little exercise for us. I would ask, though, based on being mindful of folks' time, is there a way we could maybe just amend it a little bit to be a bit shorter than our original plan of 10 minutes, maybe more like 3 to 5 minutes?
Yeah, totally. All right.
That's what I figured.
Perfect.
Fly.
Absolutely. So, and any of us who've been working in distributed teams for a long time or for a short time, one of the things that you definitely learn to do more of in the distributed space is roll with it. You're just like, oh, that didn't work, so let's keep going, right? All right, and that goes back to the double down on sort of planning, and we'll talk more about that in my call to action. But yes, if you remember in the beginning of this conversation, I offered you 2 questions, right? One was, what is something I learned from today, right? And the second one is, what is something I will try from today? And we're going to have a chance to see what is in the room right now. So if you would please look in the chat function, there is a link there that Mo has placed, and I'd like you to click on that. You might need to minimize Zoom, but stay in the Zoom connection, but just click on that link and that's going to drop you over into a whiteboard. And for those of you who are starting to open up the mural whiteboard, you're going to see down in the bottom, in the middle, that you are an avatar. You are either something like an anonymous scorpion or an anonymous sheep. And what I would invite you to do is to start double clicking under each of the questions, and a little sticky note is going to come in, and you can type in, what is something I learned today? You might say, I am amazing as a leader, right? Because you might hear so many of the best practices in there already. So, or you can go over here to the right, what is something I can try from today? Double click on that. I am going to schedule an open meeting. So why don't you just start sharing with us?
And Evelyn put into the chat another example of, some people are on desktops, some people are on laptops, some people are on phones. For those on a phone, you need an app. So again, like a great example of everyone's experience of a platform is going to be a little bit different depending on how they've joined a meeting as well.
Okay. And as you find your way here, you might be finding like, oh no, it's really small. It's a really small little sticky note. You can double click on it, and then it will come up and it'll let you make it a little bit bigger. All right.
I love how everybody's an anonymous animal of some kind. It looks like a zoo putting together sticky notes. It's fantastic. Very dynamic, with Claudia as the keeper.
And you know, one of the things that you can do, like I can do because I'm the host of this whiteboard, is that if I wanted to, you can change it to like Anita, so that you wouldn't be an anonymous ladybug. It would be Anita, right? But for this purpose,
keeping Zoom open as a way to just encourage chatting, I can see perhaps using Mural as as an open platform that perhaps a question would get prompted, and then you would give folks time over perhaps a period of hours or days to go in and make notes as well. It doesn't have to be simply a synchronous exercise, but that's one of the beauties of these online spaces, is they could be an asynchronous place of gathering information as well.
I mean, absolutely. Like my objective when working in, virtual design, like what we're doing right now in Mural, is you try to mimic face-to-face as much as possible, right? So if you would say like, look, over the next half hour, spend some time generating some ideas and go up to the whiteboard and put that on, right? Or over the course of lunch or something, tell us what you think about that, right?
Yeah.
So that, meetings feel forced enough virtually that anything we can do to decompress some of that, do that thing right now, I think, I'm all for it. So why don't you take another minute, and you're just starting to play with this. Now, something that happens in a distributed team, it can happen when we get onto a new platform. We're like, where am I? I don't know where I am right now. And that is totally fine, right? It's something that's going to happen. And so keep at it, and we'll just keep going. So what we're going to do is I will share this whiteboard with Anita and the team so that you can have this as a PDF and just sort of capture of our time together. Okay.
And will it stay open beyond when we close the meeting, Claudia? How does that work?
I can do it. I can keep it open for a little while if people are like, hey, you know what? I feel like contributing some more. So it's a nice composite of what's in the room, right? What's something I can try, because many of you are going to have a suggestion that others haven't thought of. Okay.
That's right.
So Anita, over to you.
No, over to you. Call to action.
Oh, okay. So the call to action. So I'm very excited about my call to action. So if you're still having fun and a good time over in Mural, I would ask if you could just pause that for a moment and come back to us on Zoom. I know, right? So the call to action. I've talked a lot about double downing on the deliberateness, right? So that's not my call to action. And so I have two calls to action for you. And one is two parts. One of the things that can be so hard is that we get really, really up in our heads about working in a distributed team, right? So my first call to action is do not overthink this, okay? Do not overthink. Our brains weigh, the average human brain weighs about like 15 pounds, right? So we do not need to overload it with more of our thoughts, all right? And the way I would say like, oh, that's easy for you, that's easy for anybody to say, thanks for that tip. What I'm saying is have your own back and just go, all right? So now, when I say don't overthink, but do over plan, all right, is try to double down on those deliberate pieces. Use mine that I offered here if helpful, and use your own if that resonates more, to figure out what are the pieces that I want to fit together for this team while keeping open space for other pieces yet unseen, right? Because as we know, as the good communicators and leaders we are, planning for the unplanned is part of a good plan. So that's my first call to action is don't overthink, but do over plan. Now, the last call to action, given that my point around we know distributed teams are on the rise. Okay, doesn't matter if it's COVID. Right now, it's just kind of, I'm going to be a little bit sad when it's not as alive around the world because I feel like so part of a community right now and somebody who's in a distributed space. But there's more of that ahead for all the different reasons that we've talked about here and more. So for those of you who remember the movie Finding Nemo, right? It's an epic tale about two fish who are swimming around the Great Barrier Reef in Australia looking for a baby fish. Right? And they encounter all kinds of things along the way, many of which they haven't experienced before. This, for me, is a very good analogy for a lot of teams in distributed contexts right now, right? If you've been working in a distributed team, what's new is you're working with other people who are in the first time in a distributed space. So there's newness for all of us. So sometimes it can feel a little bit choppy and a little bit windy. But as the smart fish Dory said in Finding Nemo, is just keep going, all right? She said, just keep swimming, all right? But the point is that I'm making is keep at it, is to just keep going. If you have these little micro things that you want to try, right? There's no thing that is too small to try to make the overall experience of someone else in a distributed team too small. Okay, you just don't know, right? You don't have line of sight for how you affect people. So you just don't know how much you're gonna affect someone else in a distributed team space. So what I would encourage you is to just keep going, right? And keep at it. Just keep showing up for yourself, not just for other people, but for yourself as a leader and as a communicator, right? Because we can spend all day thinking about something and then, you know, look what happens here if we're thinking a little bit too much. Okay, so I will leave it there for now.
Oh, Claudia, thank you so much. A round of applause for Claudia Chang. Sometimes
You know what? And I got a good point. Thank you for Will. He said the average brain is 3 to 4 pounds. Oh, okay. I stand corrected. Thank you for that. I don't know where I got 15 pounds. Maybe it's my overthinking brain. Thank you, Will, wherever you are out there.
Nothing like a good fact checker. Thank you, Will. Though I think your omelet quote is dubious, but we'll get to that later in the chat. You can come forward into the virtual podium later. But Claudia, thank you so much. I was saying that sometimes when discussing writing and coming up with a strong conclusion or a strong close, I talk about sticking the landing, which comes from gymnastics or other things. But when you have a speaker series like this and you've got a fifth and final speaker, you have absolutely stuck the landing 10 for 10. And I really am so grateful. I know I speak for all of us in terms of the time and the strategies and the stories and the information that you've shared based on your experience, but also really discussing it in a contemporary way in terms of what we're all experiencing now. So I'm thrilled that this was recorded. I know people will want to return to it. Thank you to the questions that came from the floor. So really, Claudia, thank you so much for this. And
it's a pleasure.
Just a announcements as we close, and then as I mentioned earlier, Claudia will generously stay on the call. Everyone is welcome to have a more informal chance to greet and thank Claudia and engage with her around these topics. But before we do the virtual rush to the podium, I just wanted to also extend a little bit of gratitude. Here we are on the final of the 5 series, and I especially want to thank the COVID consultancy, all 5 of them that have worked tirelessly over this quarter to not only create this series of speakers, of which Claudia is one, but there's been a tremendous amount of work in supporting local nonprofits and members of our community at the University of Washington in terms of the way that they meet the COVID challenge from a communications perspective. So for Stacy Stewart, Ryan Quigtar, Susan McLaren, Meg Herndon, and especially Evelyn Kuo, who's on the call here. You give a wave, Evelyn. I want everyone to be able to see you. In fact, Mo, can you spotlight Evelyn for a moment? Because Evelyn's role in the COVID consultancy is specifically to support events, and these are the events. So Evelyn, huge thanks to you for the work that you've done in pulling off this speaker series. Thank you for that. I also want to thank CommLead student Roger Caudle, who has been he's been facilitating the thought exchange, which many of you participated in advance of tonight in terms of questions to seed the conversation, which has been very helpful throughout the quarter. Mo Herbert, I want to give another shout out to. She's our CommLead student, but multimedia tutor, and has been Zoom DJ on a number of these calls and has been critical in the back end work that we do in terms of keeping the Zoom interface working well. And she works with all of our speakers in advance of their talks. So Mo, thank you very much for all of that. Thanks to my colleague, Alex Stonehill. He's a colleague of mine who is the CommLead head of creative strategy, very much a part of the stewardship and vision behind the consultancy. And so I want to thank Alex for all of his work this quarter, on top of the other work that he does and being a student in the program. It's really exceptional. We'll be sending out the video capture from tonight. I think, Claudia, if it works, let's also send the URL for the mural that people can continue to fill out. We'll have a survey that goes out. I think Evelyn's also going to drop that survey into the chat box. Great, looks like it's there. Perfect, if people want to fill that out earlier. And so just look for that in your inbox coming up. I am pretty sure we're going to see some more talks like these into the summer as the consultancy continues. So also keep an eye on your inbox for future events. That I'm very much looking forward to seeing how that unfolds, but I know I want to whet your appetite in that way. If the kind of conversation tonight is of interest to you, if you think to yourself, gosh, I'd love to take a class with Claudia, I certainly would, then definitely visit our website. We'd love to see if there are ways to get you more involved in the program. It could be as a student, it could be as a guest speaker, it could be as an instructor, partner. So please do seek us out and visit the website, spend some time. We'd love to hear from you. So now at this point, Claudia's going to remain on for a bit. We're going to cease the video, and really it's our pleasure, Claudia, to be able to continue to engage with you up until about 7 o'clock, a little after. And in the meantime, with that, please take good care. Thank you all so much for joining. Be kind to one another and be well.